The wind cut through the main street as if it had learned to do so silently, dragging dry leaves between old brick facades and faded shop windows. It was early winter in a small town in the American Midwest, a place where time seemed to move carefully so as not to awaken old memories. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that stretched across the asphalt like tired fingers. The church bell in the distance marked the hours with a deep, spaced-out sound, and each chime seemed to weigh more than the last. It was there, in that space between what had been and what had yet to happen, that Dylan Carter walked. Dylan was a war veteran, not just on paper, not just in the cold register of the Department of Veterans Affairs, but in the way his shoulders carried an invisible weight, in the attentive way he observed every corner, every reflection in glass, every unexpected noise. There was something in his eyes, a deep, marked grey, that betrayed battles fought far beyond that quiet town. He walked slowly, his worn boots touching the ground with a restrained, almost ceremonial rhythm, as if each step needed permission to exist. The city didn't greet him, not out of hostility, but out of habit. People locked their doors early there, curtains were drawn before night had fully fallen. Still, Dylan felt the stares. Not direct, not explicit. Side glances, silent judgments that hid behind lace curtains and dusty rearview mirrors. To many, he was just that veteran. To others, an uncomfortable reminder of distant wars they preferred not to remember. To himself, he was a man trying to breathe without making a sound. The distant sound of a train cut through the air, a metallic wail echoing across the plain. Dylan paused for a moment, the muscles in his neck tensing. The long, deep whistle pierced his chest like an ancient trigger. His fingers clenched into fists, reflexively, and for a brief second the world seemed to narrow, as if the street were a narrow corridor of concrete and dust. He blinked, once, twice, until the city recomposed itself before his eyes. The train moved on, the sound faded, and silence returned, heavy, almost respectful. There was a small house at the end of the street, its paint peeling and a rusty swing on the porch. A dim light remained on in the front window, insistent like a lone watchman. Dylan stared in that direction longer than he intended. His face didn't betray any clear emotion. But something stirred inside, an old premonition, the feeling that this night wouldn't be just another one. The war veteran knew this feeling well. It usually preceded moments that changed everything. The snow hadn't started to fall yet, but the cold was already seeping into his bones. Dylan pulled his coat closer to his body. The fabric had the familiar smell of cheap soap and distant smoke, mixed with something older, harder to name. Sand, oil, dried blood that only existed in memory. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, as he had learned years ago, in foreign lands, when the world crumbled around him and the only thing left was to control the air entering and leaving his lungs. Footsteps echoed behind him. Dylan didn't turn around immediately. He counted the rhythm, the distance, the weight, an impossible habit to break. When he finally looked over his shoulder, he saw only the empty street and the long shadow of a lamppost. Nothing more. Still, his heart beat a little faster, not from fear, but from anticipation. Something was approaching. He didn't know what. He only knew how to recognize the silence that precedes the impact. At that very moment, somewhere in that sleeping city, harsh words would be spoken. Judgments would be made. Someone would say, with conviction and contempt, "You can't raise that baby." Dylan couldn't hear the words yet, but they already existed, suspended in the air like a blade about to fall. And when they did fall, they would strike not only a fragile life, but the scarred heart of a war veteran who believed he had already survived everything. He resumed walking. Each step took him deeper into that night, into that story that was slowly unfolding, like a scar that begins to burn even before it opens. The city seemed to watch him now, in absolute silence, as if it knew that something was about to happen, something that would force everyone to see the truth behind that silent man, the truth behind that war veteran. Before moving on, allow yourself a small gesture that helps stories like this continue to exist. If this opening has already sparked something in you, leave a like. It shows that this story deserves to be told. Each like helps this content reach more people who value human and profound stories. By subscribing to the channel, you ensure you won't miss the next chapters of this intense journey. Here, each story is crafted to evoke emotion, provoke reflection, and captivate until the very last second. Your support transforms silence into reach, and reach into continuity. Stay with us until the end. What comes next changes everything. And now take a deep breath, because the war veteran's story is only just beginning. Dylan Carter woke up every day before sunrise. Not because he needed to, not because he had commitments, but because his body had never forgotten how to survive in hostile territories. The clock beside his bed always showed around 5 in the morning when his eyes would suddenly open, as if someone had called his name in a low voice. The room was simple, almost austere, light walls, few pieces of furniture, a bed made with excessive precision. Nothing there was decorative, everything obeyed the logic of control. Control of space, of silence, of his own mind. He remained motionless for a few seconds, listening. The distant creaking of an old house, adjusting to the cold. The occasional bark of a dog, the wind hitting the window. Dylan catalogued each sound, as he did on the battlefield. Only then did he sit up, his feet touching the icy floor, feeling the weight of his own body as confirmation that he was still there. Alive. Present. At home, although that word still sounded strange to him. In the kitchen, the coffee was always the same. Strong, bitter, no sugar. Steam rose slowly from the chipped mug, and Dylan held the container with both hands, as if that warmth were one of the few luxuries he allowed himself. He didn't turn on the television, he didn't put on music. Silence was part of the ritual. For a war veteran, silence could be both a refuge and a threat, but Dylan had learned to coexist with it. After coffee came the walk. Always the same route, through the same streets. The city was already beginning to wake up, but kept its distance. Some people greeted him with a restrained wave, others looked away, some whispered. Dylan didn't need to hear to understand. He felt it. He felt it in the way conversations ceased when he passed, in the way mothers pulled their children a little closer. It wasn't explicit hatred, it was distrust. The most silent and cruel kind. Dylan Carter was known as a war veteran, but few knew exactly what that meant. For many, veteran was just a word, something distant, abstract, comfortable, as long as it remained far away. They didn't see the sleepless nights, the nightmares that dragged him from bed with a racing heart, the cold sweat running down his back as if he were still under enemy fire. They didn't see the hands that trembled slightly when an unexpected sound echoed too loudly. They didn't see the daily struggle to appear normal in a world that no longer made sense in the same way. His income came from temporary jobs, repairs, small renovations, replacing a door, fixing a fence, reinforcing a roof before winter. Dylan was efficient, quiet, and punctual, qualities learned in the war and repurposed in civilian life. Even so, he rarely received invitations for larger jobs. There was always someone more suitable, someone more stable. Polite words that hid the same old fear. What might a war veteran carry within him? The only place Dylan lingered a little longer was the small town market. There, Jimmy Brooks worked at the cash register. Jimmy talked too much, perhaps to compensate for Dylan's silence. He commented on the weather, the price of gasoline, the game from the previous night. Dylan responded with monosyllables, but listened to everything. Deep down, Jimmy seemed to like that silent presence. Perhaps because she wasn't judgmental. Perhaps because Dylan knew how to keep secrets, even when they weren't spoken. There was also Rose Whitman, who looked after the community library. She always set aside a book before Dylan arrived, pretending it was a coincidence. Old stories, biographies, nothing about war, never about war. Rose smiled in a sad, respectful way, like someone who recognizes pain without trying to touch it. Dylan thanked her with a brief nod. Between them, a kind of silent pact had formed, not to ask too many questions. At night, back at the small house at the end of the street, Dylan tended to the yard. He pulled weeds with almost obsessive precision. He organized tools. He fixed things that weren't broken. His mind needed to be occupied. When it wasn't, memories found space. And when they came, they didn't ask permission. Internal conflicts were constant. Dylan questioned his place in that world. He questioned whether he truly belonged in that city, or if he was merely a tolerated visitor, a war veteran living among people who had never heard a gunshot up close. He felt guilty for being alive, guilty for trying to move on, guilty even for desiring something simple, like peace. The war hadn't ended within him, and he knew it. Sometimes he would sit on the porch at dusk, watching the sky change color. The swing creaked softly in the wind, a repetitive sound that calmed him. Other times, that same sound transported him to places he preferred to forget. Dylan would close his eyes, take a deep breath, and count. 1, 2, 3. Ancient techniques for surviving attacks that now came from within. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for help. Like many war veterans, he had learned that resistance was synonymous with silence. But something was building up. A feeling that this routine, this controlled solitude, was about to be interrupted. The city seemed too calm, the nights too long. Dylan didn't know it yet, but his life was on the verge of a change that would test everything he believed about himself, about what it meant to be strong, and above all, about what it meant to be worthy of caring for someone. And as he turned off the lights that night, lying down once more with his eyes open in the darkness, the war veteran had no idea that the silence he had tried so hard to control was about to be broken, not by gunfire, not by explosions, but by a responsibility that would demand a very different kind of courage than the one he had learned on the battlefield. Before he was known in that town as a war veteran, before the invisible scars and the calculated silence, Dylan Carter was just a country boy raised on dirt roads, wooden fences, and horizons too wide to fit into small dreams. He was born and raised in a region where mornings began early, and a man's worth was measured more by what he did than by what he said. His father, Bruce Carter, worked at whatever came his way, fixing engines, building sheds, helping neighbors without ever charging more than necessary. His mother, Clover Carter, kept the house in order with quiet firmness, teaching that dignity makes no noise. Dylan learned to observe early on. He would sit on the porch next to his father, listening to stories that were never entirely complete, but always full of meaning. Bruce spoke little about feelings, but a lot about responsibility. He taught his son that when someone depends on you, no matter the fear, the tiredness, or the pain, you show up. That simple lesson would become a silent axis in Dylan's life, long before he understood the true weight of those words. At school, Dylan wasn't the most talkative or the most popular, but he was respected. He possessed a precocious seriousness, a sense of justice that made him intervene when he saw something wrong, not out of bravado, but instinct. He defended younger classmates, confronted injustices that others pretended not to see. His teachers said he had potential, but Dylan never knew exactly what for. The world seemed too big, and at the same time too distant. It was during adolescence that his dreams began to take shape. Dylan wanted to leave, to see something beyond the repetitive roads and the same stories told generation after generation. He didn't reject his origins. On the contrary, he was proud of them. But there was a constant restlessness within him, a desire to serve something greater, to test his limits, to prove to himself that he was capable of enduring more than simple life seemed to demand. The relationship with his father deepened during those years. Bruce could see his son's restlessness, even without directly asking questions. On quiet nights, the two would walk together around the house, and Bruce would talk about choices. He never pressured Dylan, never pushed him anywhere. He simply said that every man, at some point, needs to decide what kind of burden he is willing to carry. Dylan listened, absorbed the words, and felt that this conversation was preparing him for something that didn't yet have a name. Around the same time, Dylan met Brianna Lewis. She was different from the other people in town. She had an attentive, curious gaze, and a quiet courage to speak her mind. Brianna saw beyond Dylan's silence. They talked for hours, sitting in the back of an old pickup truck, talking about the future, about possibilities that seemed improbable, but not impossible. With her, Dylan laughed more. He dreamed more. For the first time, he imagined a life that wasn't just about resistance. But the world outside that city imposed itself abruptly. The news spoke of conflicts, of soldiers, of duty. To Dylan, it didn't sound like empty propaganda. It sounded like a calling. He felt that everything he had learned up to that point, discipline, loyalty, sacrifice, pointed in that direction. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It was silent, matured over sleepless nights. When Clover told his family he was enlisting, he wept silently. Bruce simply nodded, his gaze heavy but proud. He didn't try to stop his son. He just hugged him longer than usual. I told him that war changes men, but that character decides whether that change breaks them or strengthens them. Dylan kept those words like an invisible amulet. Brianna was the last to know. The conversation took place at dusk, the sky tinged with orange and blue. She tried to reason with him, tried to make him see the risks. Dylan didn't promise he would return the same. He didn't promise everything would be all right. He only promised he would do what he believed was right. They hugged for a long time, knowing that this gesture carried farewell and hope in equal measure. On the day he left, the city seemed smaller. The familiar streets, the familiar faces, everything took on a new weight. Dylan didn't leave as a hero. He left as a young man carrying expectations, fear, and a silent conviction that he was fulfilling something greater than himself. At that moment, he wasn't yet a war veteran. He was just a man about to become someone he never imagined he could be. The bus took Dylan away, while Clover waved with a trembling hand, and Bruce maintained a firm posture. The road stretched ahead, long and unknown. Dylan looked out the window until the city disappeared completely. He didn't know what awaited him. He didn't know about the losses, the traumas, the deep scars that would come. He only knew that he was crossing a point of no return. And there, in that silent moment between the past and the future, was born the man who would one day return as a war veteran, shaped not only by the conflict, but defined by the choices made long before the first shot was fired. War didn't arrive in Dylan Carter's life as an immediate explosion, but as a slow erasure of references. The first impact wasn't the sound of gunfire, nor the smell of gunpowder. It was the feeling of being far from everything that defined him. The sky was different, the earth had a different color, and the silence, when it existed, wasn't the same silence of mornings in the small town. There, silence was a tense pause, a breath held before the inevitable. Dylan realized early on that, in that place, time didn't heal anything. It only accumulated. As a war veteran in training, he had learned to obey, to move with precision, to trust his senses more than his thoughts. The training had hardened his body, but it was the battlefield that began to mold something deeper and more dangerous. The first patrols seemed unreal, as if he were walking inside a film without a soundtrack. The heat was oppressive. The weight of the equipment crushed his shoulders, and every step demanded absolute attention. Dylan felt his heart pounding too hard, but his face remained still. He had learned to hide it. Names began to stick in his memory even before the scenes. Jimmy, a soldier with an easy laugh, who spoke of home as if describing a distant dream. Bruce, not his father, but a comrade in arms, older, whose gaze carried an old weariness. They became an improvised family, united not by blood, but by the certainty that they would depend on each other to return alive. Dylan trusted them with an intensity he had never experienced. In war, trust is a form of survival. The first confrontations came without proper warning. A dry crack in the distance, a scream, a short command. The body reacted before the mind. Dylan would later remember the metallic smell in the air, the dust rising like a thick veil, the feeling that the world had fragmented into small, disconnected frames. He did everything right. He followed protocols. He protected his companions. And yet, something was lost that day. Something that never returned. There was one particular night that never left him. The camp was too quiet. The radio crackled with interference, and the sky seemed heavy, starless. Dylan was on guard duty when he heard the sound. Not loud, but precise, calculated. Time slowed. He remembers thinking of Clover in the kitchen at home, and Brianna smiling in the sun. He remembers gripping the rifle too tightly. Then, chaos. Overlapping orders. A flash. and the silence that followed, dense, crushing. When the dust settled, Jimmy didn't answer. Dylan approached, knelt beside him, calling his name in a desperate whisper, as if speaking softly could undo what he saw. There were no visible injuries to explain everything, and that made the scene even harder to accept. Dylan stood there for seconds that felt like hours, until someone pulled him back to reality. He stood up mechanically, but something inside him had broken irreversibly. From that day on, his dreams changed. Dylan began waking up with the feeling that he was still there, that he needed to react, to run, to protect someone. Sleep became a minefield. Every time he closed his eyes, images appeared uninvited. They weren't complete scenes, but fragments. Hands dirty with dust, the distant sound of a helicopter, the weight of an inert body. He didn't talk about it. As a war veteran, he had learned that silence was resistance. Bruce, his older comrade, had tried to warn him once. He said that the war doesn't end when the service is over. Dylan nodded, but didn't fully understand. He still believed that simply returning home, breathing familiar air, would make everything all right. He didn't know that war infiltrates, that it takes invisible root and grows in places where no one sees it. There were moments of courage, yes. Moments when Dylan saved lives, when he made quick decisions that made a difference. These moments, paradoxically, also weighed heavily. Because for every success, there was a doubt. For every survivor, an absence. The mathematics of war never balances without leaving a negative balance. Dylan began to carry guilt, not only for what he lost, but for what he managed to preserve. When he finally returned, his body was whole, but his mind bore deep scars. The war veteran came back different, though he tried to hide it. People said he seemed quieter, more serious. No one saw the constant effort to appear normal. No one saw the veteran waking up in the middle of the night, his heart racing, his room transformed into a hostile scene for a few interminable seconds. The memories didn't just come in dreams. They came in the sound of a door slamming, the sound of a sputtering engine, the dry crackle of an exhaust pipe. Dylan reacted with immediate tension, his muscles braced for a danger that no longer existed. He knew this rationally, but his body wouldn't obey. His body remembered. His body never forgets. The war left scars that don't bleed, but ache constantly. It left unanswered questions and a permanent feeling of being watched. Dylan, a war veteran, learned to live with these marks like someone learning to walk with a weight strapped to their chest. He didn't complain, he didn't dramatize, he just kept going one day at a time. But even during that time, something endured. A small, almost invisible flame, a sense of responsibility that refused to die. Dylan didn't know it yet, but it would be precisely this part, forged before the war, tested during the conflict, and kept alive despite the trauma, that would place him before the greatest challenge of his life. A challenge that would involve neither weapons nor visible enemies, but would demand a deeper courage than any battlefield had ever required. The war marked him forever. But it didn't define him completely. Not yet. Dylan Carter's routine remained untouched for longer than he had imagined. The days repeated the same silent pattern, as if life had decided to spare him surprises. For a war veteran, predictability was a kind of refuge. Still, there was something in the air in that small town that was beginning to shift, almost imperceptibly, like the pressure before a storm. Dylan felt it in his body even before he understood it with his mind. The war had trained him to recognize subtle signs of rupture. The first clue came on a grey afternoon when Dylan was called for a simple job on the outskirts of town. An old, isolated house that few people frequented. It belonged to Rose Whitman, the same woman from the library, but she wasn't the one who directly needed help. Rose had spoken of a young woman in trouble, someone who needed just a quick fix. Dylan accepted without question. He always accepted. Upon arriving, he noticed the house had a different atmosphere. It wasn't just abandonment, it was tension. The silence there wasn't calm, it was expectant. Dylan walked down the narrow hallway, feeling the floor creak beneath his feet, when he heard muffled voices coming from the back of the house. It wasn't an open argument, but words laden with reproach. He didn't try to listen, but one phrase pierced the air with brutal clarity. "You can't raise this baby." The sentence stopped Dylan where he stood. The war veteran felt the same tightness in his chest that preceded ambushes. Not because he understood the full context, but because of the weight of that sentence. He knew that tone. He had heard similar orders before, disguised as logic, as authority. The sentence wasn't just about incompetence. It was about the denial of humanity. When he entered the room, he saw Brianna Lewis sitting at the table, her hands clasped tightly together. Her eyes were red but dry, as if her crying had been forcibly stopped. Opposite her was Bruce Hale, a respected man in the city, known for his firm opinions and his certainty that he always knew what was best for others. Next to them, Dylan recognized Clover Reynolds, a local social worker who maintained a professional but clearly uncomfortable demeanor. Brianna looked up when she saw Dylan. There was a mixture of surprise and something deeper, relief, perhaps, or despair. Dylan said nothing. He only greeted her with a brief nod and focused on the work he had been called to do. But, as a war veteran, he knew when a side mission came up, even if no one had explicitly requested it. While adjusting a loose hinge, Dylan overheard fragments of the conversation. Bruce spoke of stability, of history, of the right kind of environment for a child. Clover mentioned reports, evaluations, deadlines. Brianna responded little. Her voice was low but firm, like someone struggling to maintain control as the ground slowly gives way. That's when Dylan heard his own name. "And this veteran?" Bruce said, barely concealing his polite disdain. "Do you really think someone like him can be an example? A man scarred by war?" Dylan felt his blood boil, but he didn't react immediately. In the war, he had learned that impulsiveness costs lives. He took a deep breath, finished the repair, and only then turned around. The silence that settled was heavy. All eyes fell on him. The war veteran felt that old judgment, all too familiar. Brianna spoke before he could. She said Dylan had nothing to do with it, but the seed had already been planted. Dylan understood in that instant that he hadn't just been called to fix a house. He had been called because, somehow, he was already part of that story. Not by conscious choice, but by constant presence, by being someone Brianna trusted when the world began to close in on her. After Bruce and Clover left, Brianna remained seated, motionless. Dylan stood there for a few seconds, unsure whether he should leave. As a war veteran, he was used to clear orders and defined objectives. This situation, however, demanded something different. It demanded human initiative. She finally spoke. She said she was pregnant. She said people didn't believe she could raise the child alone. She said they mentioned Dylan, the lonely, silent war veteran, as yet another factor against her, an unsuitable environment, an unstable influence. Dylan felt an old weight return, but now mixed with something new, indignation. He made no promises. He made no speeches. He simply listened. When Brianna finished, there was a thick silence between them. Dylan realized that this was the moment when he would normally retreat, the moment when he would choose not to get involved. The war had taught him to survive, not to put down roots. But something within him resisted. That night, back at his house, Dylan couldn't sleep. The words echoed in his mind like delayed gunshots. "You can't raise this baby." He thought about what that meant. He thought about Bruce Carter, his father, and the silent lessons. He thought about Jimmy, about Bruce, about those who didn't come back. He thought about the idea of responsibility, not as an imposed obligation, but as a conscious choice. The calling event didn't come with sirens or explosions. It came with judgment. It came with the attempt to define limits to the capacity to love and protect. Dylan realized, with painful clarity, that this situation would demand something from him that he had never been trained to do. To remain. Not just to react, but to endure. At dawn, while the sky was still pale, the war veteran made a silent decision. He didn't yet know how or where it would lead him. He only knew he couldn't ignore it. The war had taught him to confront the enemy. Life, now, summoned him to confront prejudice, fear, and doubt, including his own. And so, Dylan Carter's routine was definitively broken. Not by explicit violence, but by a calling that touched him deepest inside. A calling that would transform his silence into action and put to the test everything it truly meant to be a war veteran. Dylan Carter woke that morning with the weight of the previous night still pressing on his shoulders. The silence of his once comfortable home now seemed like the echo of a silent challenge. Every object, every wall, seemed to remind him of what he had witnessed. The phrase that had cut through the air, laden with judgment, and Brianna's expression, a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and hope. The war veteran, accustomed to assessing situations under extreme pressure, felt that this moment demanded something different. Not weapons, not military tactics. It demanded humanity. As he stepped out into the yard, Dylan took a deep breath, feeling the cold seep into his bones. The snow hadn't fallen yet, but the air was biting, and the wind carried with it a sense that the world was about to test him in a way no war could. He knew that protecting Brianna and the baby required more than just physical presence. It required understanding, patience, and courage. Qualities that manifested themselves in subtle but powerful ways. The first step was simple, and at the same time, monumental. Dylan decided to offer concrete support, starting with the essentials. Safety. He had no experience in motherhood or raising children, but he knew how to organize, plan, and act under pressure. Skills that had saved lives in conflicts and that would now be applied differently. He bought supplies, made sure Brianna's apartment was safe and accessible, and began to think about routines that could minimize risks. Each gesture was slow, calculated, but filled with a warmth that surprised even Dylan himself. His initial contact with Brianna was discreet. He didn't want to impose his presence. He entered her life carefully, like someone who understands that trust isn't demanded, it's earned. He observed her habits, understood her routine, her rest schedules, the needs of the unborn baby. And above all, he remained attentive to signs of emotional stress. Dylan knew that protecting didn't just mean acting physically, but recognizing vulnerabilities and responding with sensitivity. In the early days, Dylan took on tasks that seemed trivial, but had a great emotional impact. He prepared meals, organized the house, and ensured Brianna had moments of rest. Each action was silent, but spoke volumes. He quickly learned about the importance of small gestures. A clean towel left nearby, medicine organized, a blanket ready to warm the baby. There was something profoundly human in this, something reminiscent of the invisible bonds that form amidst the chaos of war, the feeling of complete responsibility for the other, when every detail can mean survival. One particular episode left a lasting mark on Dylan. One night, Brianna panicked with an unexpected pain. She was alone, and the baby, though still in the womb, seemed to react to the mother's anxiety. Dylan, without hesitation, calmly guided her, recalling basic procedures he had learned in emergency training. He kept his voice firm but comforting, guiding each breath, each step. When the paramedics arrived, he was by her side, offering emotional support, but without dramatizing. The courage in that moment didn't come from explosive bravery, but from constant presence, from self-control amidst the fear of the other. The war veteran also faced resistance. City residents, neighbors, and family members questioned his presence. Malicious comments and suspicious glances constantly arose. He's a veteran. Maybe he's not in a position to take care of anyone. Dylan learned to ignore these external and internal criticisms. Every doubt was met with consistent actions. He didn't need to convince anyone with words. His actions spoke for themselves. There were moments of hesitation. Dylan felt fear, not of failing physically, but of not being up to the emotional responsibility. He remembered the patrols in the war, the weight of deciding about lives, the silent regret for those he couldn't save. Each memory became fuel, not an obstacle. He realized that true courage lay not in repeating heroic acts of the past, but in applying everything he had learned in a human way: patience, empathy, responsibility, and resilience. For the baby yet to be born, Dylan became a silent but steadfast presence. He carefully studied a child's needs, consulted experts, read books, and observed patterns. Every night that Brianna slept restlessly, he stayed awake, alert, ready to intervene if necessary. The war had taught him the importance of vigilance, but now he applied that vigilance to preserve joy, health, and hope. The bond between Dylan and Brianna grew naturally, based on respect and trust. He never invaded her privacy, but was always available, offering support without demanding recognition. Every gesture was calculated to convey security and comfort. When the city whispered criticism, Dylan stood firm, remembering that protecting someone requires courage not to applaud grand acts, but to sustain daily life with responsibility and love. There was a night when Dylan sat on the porch with Brianna, watching the dark sky dotted with stars. He spoke little, but enough to show understanding. She smiled, a slight smile, but full of relief. In that instant, Dylan realized that courage wasn't just about acting in visible crises. It was about being present in the invisible details, in the small actions that build trust, security, and humanity. The war veteran, who had previously felt limited by his own silence and the scars of the past, discovered an unprecedented strength. The strength to persevere, to act with kindness and determination, even when no one was watching. Every challenge that arose, unexpected pains, criticism from the city, internal doubts, was faced with the same discipline that had once kept him alive in conflict zones. But this time, the victory was not over external enemies. It was over internal fears, prejudices, and the uncertainty of the future. Dylan knew that this act of courage would transcend any official record. There were no medals, applause, or military reports that could measure the impact of what he was doing. True bravery, he realized, lay in standing firm in the face of judgment, in sustaining the life of another being with care and attention, and in accepting that fear would not be eliminated, but managed with discipline and empathy. And at the end of each day, as the morning light began to break through the darkness, and Dylan watched Brianna rest with a more tranquil expression, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: purpose. A profound sense that the war had given him tools, but life now offered him the opportunity to apply them to preserve, protect, and above all, humanize. The veteran's act of courage wasn't explosive. It didn't draw attention. It didn't demand applause. It was silent, constant, and fundamental. Dylan Carter understood in that instant that the true measure of a man, of any man, was not only in the battles he had fought, but in his ability to transform learning, discipline, and resilience into protection, love, and hope. And so, the war veteran became a beacon of safety and humanity, proving that courage is not the absence of fear, but the conscious decision to act on behalf of someone, even when everything within oneself calls for hesitation. He didn't need approval. The greatest recognition would come from within, and from the silent yet eternal impact on Brianna's life, and the life of the baby who was about to be born. Dylan had finally discovered that some battles aren't won with weapons. They're won with presence, patience, and love. And the deepest courage arises precisely when one chooses to protect without expecting anything in return. War had taught Dylan to survive. Life was now teaching him to be truly human. If you'd like, I can continue now with topic 7, the greater conflict. Maintaining the same level of cinematic and emotional detail, exploring the story's peak tension. Do you want me to continue? Dylan Carter's life, which until then had followed a quiet rhythm of support and constant presence, began to transform into an almost palpable tension. The greatest conflict did not come from a sudden attack, nor from a medical emergency. It came from the resistance of the world around him, from the distrust rooted in glances and words, and from the shadows of the war veteran's own past that insisted on resurfacing in the most delicate moments. The silence of the city, which had once been his refuge, now became a constant pressure, an invisible wall that seemed to crush him from all sides. In the days following his initial act of courage, Dylan realized that simply being present wouldn't be enough. The entire town began to whisper. Veiled comments, suspicious glances, insinuating questions. Everything suggested he wasn't trustworthy. A lone war veteran taking care of a baby, is that safe? The words didn't need to be spoken aloud. Dylan felt them in the air, like a lingering scent, permeating every interaction. Brianna, for her part, began to feel the weight of this pressure. She tried to keep the baby safe and healthy, but the constant judgment eroded her confidence. And Dylan, accustomed to dealing with the tension of real combat, realized that this kind of battle was different. There were no explosions, gunshots, or clear orders. There was only silent resistance, veiled hostility, and the need to protect someone who couldn't fight for themselves in the same way. In one incident, deeply affected Dylan. He was helping Brianna reorganize her apartment, making small adjustments to make the space safer and more functional. A neighbor, who normally kept his distance, abruptly entered, questioning his presence. His words carried disdain and suspicion. "I don't know if you should be here. This isn't work for someone like you." Dylan felt the familiar pang of anger, but the discipline he learned in the war prevailed. He responded calmly, firmly, but without aggression. "I'm here because I can help, nothing more." Despite this, Dylan's internal conflict began to grow. The war veteran was used to situations where every decision had immediate consequences. Every move could save lives or take them. Now, he faced a kind of battle where morality was questioned, and success was not measured in survival, but in confidence, acceptance, and emotional stability. Every disapproving look from the town was a challenge. Every silent comment, an invisible battle that demanded constant resistance. Meanwhile, Brianna began to show signs of stress. The pregnancy progressed, and the fear of others' judgment mingled with the natural anxiety of someone expecting a baby. Dylan felt his heart clench, as if each of her worries was a call to protect her even more. He knew he couldn't fail. And paradoxically, he realized he was dealing with a type of enemy that couldn't be confronted with brute force or military strategies, only with patience, empathy, and moral courage. The biggest obstacle arose when Bruce Hale, the man who had first questioned Dylan's capacity, decided to take the case to local authorities. Reports on Brianna's emotional stability, Dylan's presence, and his military background were presented with the intention of removing the baby before it was even born. Dylan felt the world closing in around him. It was a legal and social battle, but to him, it felt like a life-or-death struggle. Every paper signed, every meeting at town hall or with social workers was a silent ambush, testing his patience, his self-control, and his determination. The nights grew longer. Dylan couldn't fully rest, feeling the tension permeating every shadow in the apartment. He mentally reviewed every action, every decision, every word spoken. The war had taught him to plan, but now he needed to anticipate judgments, criticisms, and suspicions. Every move had to be perfect, every gesture calculated to convey confidence and security without provoking even more resistance. At the height of the conflict, Dylan faced a critical moment. Brianna received news that his presence could be considered detrimental to the baby's well-being, according to a technical assessment by someone who had never met the veteran personally. She panicked, and the baby began to react to her stress. Dylan, with a heavy heart, realized he needed to act not only as a physical protector, but as an emotional stabilizer. Every word, every touch, every gesture needed to convey absolute security. He took a deep breath, remembering the war days when the lives of friends depended on precise decisions under extreme pressure. The city seemed to watch everything with invisible eyes. Whispers grew louder, judgments persisted. Dylan felt the weight of his own history, losses, traumatic memories, invisible scars, returning like ghosts that tested him. The war veteran understood that, in this confrontation, the enemy was not a person or a concrete situation. It was collective fear, prejudice, doubt. And, to win, he would need to find strength within himself. Strength that did not depend on military training, but on humanity and emotional resilience. Internal conflicts intensified. Dylan wondered if it would be enough. If he was prepared to safeguard not only Brianna and the baby's safety, but also the city's and his own trust. Each internal doubt was an additional pressure. He relived past decisions from the war, remembering failures and successes, trying to transfer the acquired discipline to a situation that had no comparison. It was during a particularly cold night that Dylan became aware of the magnitude of the challenge. Watching Brianna sleep with a worried expression, the veteran felt a wave of absolute responsibility. It wasn't just a matter of protecting, it was a matter of fighting prejudice, of proving to everyone and to himself that courage and humanity could coexist. He realized that for the first time, his battle would not be measured in physical survival, but in moral and emotional victory. Dylan began to create silent strategies. Every interaction with neighbors, authorities, and family members was carefully planned. He became a master of patience, balancing firmness and gentleness, showing through actions, not words, that responsibility could be assumed safely and reliably. The city, which had previously looked at him with suspicion, began to sense the quiet determination of this war veteran, although many still didn't fully realize it. The larger conflict did not diminish. On the contrary, it intensified with each passing day. Every legal challenge, every silent trial, every doubt in Brianna's eyes was a constant reminder that Dylan was in a different battle. But he did not back down. The war had taught him resilience, strategy, and courage. Now, he was learning to apply those qualities in a human way, confronting fears that could not be neutralized by weapons, tactics, or orders. Amidst all of this, Dylan felt something emerge. A quiet clarity, a profound moral certainty. The fight wasn't just about protecting, but about transforming everyone's perception of courage, responsibility, and humanity. He realized that winning this conflict would require everything he had learned in the past, everything he had forgotten about himself, and above all, the ability to act with integrity and empathy in the face of forces that could not be combated with violence, but only with persistence, patience, and love. The war veteran finally understood that this was the ultimate test. Not a test of physical strength, nor of strategic skill, but of character. Every sleepless night, every doubt faced, every criticism received was proof that true courage is often unseen. It is silent, constant, and relentless. Dylan was finally ready to face the greatest challenge of his life, knowing that the outcome would define not only Brianna's and the baby's future, but the very measure of his humanity. If you'd like, I can now continue with topic 8, the breaking point, which will be the most profound and painful point in the story, while maintaining the cinematic and emotional level. Do you want me to continue? Night fell over the small town in the countryside, with a stillness that seemed too exaggerated to be mere silence. Dylan Carter felt every shadow as a weight on his chest, every distant noise as a warning crackle he couldn't ignore. He was exhausted, not only physically, but emotionally. The major conflict that had taken hold in Brianna and the baby's lives had reached its peak. Criticism, suspicion, and veiled threats culminated in almost unbearable pressure. For the war veteran, accustomed to reacting objectively to situations of extreme risk, this battle seemed devoid of clear rules, and that made everything more painful. That day, Dylan had arrived at Brianna's apartment to help her with routine tasks, but he found the atmosphere heavy with tension. She was crying, clutching her stomach tightly, and her hands trembled with anxiety. The situation had been aggravated by an official letter she had received earlier. A notification that her presence could be legally challenged, and that the baby's well-being could be called into question because of her military past. The veteran felt a knot in his stomach. It wasn't the kind of pressure that could be faced with discipline or technique, but something that demanded a different kind of courage, an internal, silent one. Dylan sat beside Brianna, holding her hands tightly, but his own body trembled inside. The entire city seemed to conspire against him. Neighbors whispered, family members questioned, authorities coldly assessed. Everything he had built in terms of trust and protection was about to be challenged. He remembered the battlefields, the moments when losing a second meant the death of a friend. But now the threat was invisible. It couldn't be neutralized with weapons or military strategies. It was an invisible enemy, attacking trust, hope, and humanity itself. Brianna's crying intensified, mixed with frustration and fear. Dylan felt an old memory surge with almost physical force. The death of Jimmy, his comrade, whom he couldn't save in a surprise attack. The veteran relived every detail of that night, every decision made in seconds, every face of a comrade who would never return. The weight of old guilt mingled with the present, creating an emotional whirlwind that almost made him crumble. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to breathe, trying to find balance amidst the chaos. But the breaking point wasn't just about Dylan. It was about Brianna, about the baby who still didn't have a name, about the need for protection and care that couldn't be postponed. She looked at him with pleading eyes, a mixture of fear and trust that hit him with brutal force. Dylan felt something break inside him. The thin line between control and despair snapped. For the first time in a long time, tears came involuntarily, and he couldn't hold them back. He stood up, pacing the apartment, trying to organize his thoughts, trying to control his body, which now seemed to react autonomously. Every sound, every shadow, every gesture of Brianna's brought back memories of the war, moments he thought he had left behind. The internal noise was deafening, voices of lost friends, cries of warning, orders, frustrations, fears. Dylan felt himself in the midst of an emotional storm that could not be faced with military tactics, only with courage and vulnerability. It was at that moment that the reality of the baby became intensely tangible. Dylan gently touched Brianna's belly, feeling the movement of the little being who depended entirely on them. He understood, as never before, that the responsibility was not only physical, but also moral and emotional. Every wrong decision could have irreversible consequences. The veteran, accustomed to protecting with precision, realized that he couldn't control everything, but he could be present, firm, resilient, and human. The collapse reached its peak when the apartment door burst open and a local authority entered, bringing with it questions and reports about the supposed risk. Dylan felt the pressure explode like a wave. Anger, fear, despair, and guilt mingled, making each breath painful. He almost succumbed to the feeling of powerlessness, the same feeling he had experienced in the war when faced with the loss of friends. But then he looked at Brianna, at the baby, and realized that surrender was not an option. The war veteran fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment, tears mingling with physical and emotional exhaustion. But even on his knees, he felt a thread of strength emerge. It wasn't combat strength nor physical endurance, but a strength of purpose. The awareness that protecting, loving, and supporting could be done even in the most devastating moments. Every emotion, every painful memory, every external judgment became fuel to remain steadfast. Dylan took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a few seconds, as if preparing for the most important decision of his life. He understood that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. That the most heroic act at that moment would not be to confront visible enemies, but to confront the doubts, prejudices, and traumas that had haunted him since the war. When he finally stood up, the veteran carried within him the paradoxical combination of vulnerability and strength. He knew that the breaking point had transformed something inside him. Pain had become clarity. Despair had become determination. Dylan realized that he could fail in many aspects, but not in what mattered most: being present, protecting Brianna and the baby, and facing the world with humanity despite everything. The night passed slowly. Dylan remained vigilant, not like a soldier on patrol, but like someone who understood the depth of love and responsibility. Every movement he made was calculated with empathy, every word thought to soothe, every gesture to offer security. He felt the tension gradually lessen, not because the external conflict had ended, but because he had found within himself a balance that until then had seemed impossible. In the silence that followed, Dylan Carter understood a fundamental truth. Some battles are not won by force, nor by strategy, nor by physical courage. They are won by the ability to persevere, to face fear, pain, and judgment with integrity, empathy, and love. The war veteran, for the first time in a long time, felt that he could survive not only the memories of war, but also the challenges of protecting those he loved from a world that was not yet ready to understand his courage. The tension that had been building up in the preceding days and nights had reached its peak. Dylan Carter, a war veteran, stood facing a challenge that would test not only his courage, but his humanity. The entire city seemed invisibly watching him, each suspicious glance and each silent comment contributing to the crushing pressure on his chest. Brianna's and the baby's future The trust he had slowly built and his own emotional integrity were at stake. He knew that any hesitation could be costly, but at the same time, he knew he couldn't act violently nor hastily. He needed to act with clarity and compassion. That morning, Brianna received yet another official notification. A meeting would be held at the town hall, and all assessments regarding her ability to raise the baby would be reviewed, including questions about Dylan's presence. She realized there was no time for fear nor for doubt. All that remained was to act with quiet determination, as she had done countless times during the war, but now applying each lesson to the context of real life, where the most powerful weapon was integrity. Upon arriving at City Hall, Dylan felt the tension in the air. Each corridor seemed to narrow, every glance conveyed judgment. He walked beside Brianna, holding her hand discreetly, transmitting quiet confidence. As a war veteran, he knew that leadership wasn't just about command. It was about example, presence, conveying security even when everything around suggested chaos. He kept his gaze steady, his body erect, and took a deep breath before entering the room where the evaluations would be heard. The meeting began with the harshest arguments against Brianna and her decision to allow Dylan to actively participate in preparing for the baby's arrival. Reports detailed alleged emotional instability, questioned Dylan's military background, and presented technical data intended to undermine his credibility. Brianna held his hand tightly, visibly apprehensive. Dylan felt the pressure mounting, but also realized that the time for hesitation had passed. Every word he spoke needed to be precise, full of sincerity and firmness. When it was his turn to speak, Dylan took a deep breath and began, his voice clear but calm. He spoke about responsibility, discipline, and the importance of being present. He didn't mention the war as a justification of his ability, but as a learning tool. He described how the experience of protecting lives under extreme circumstances taught him to remain calm, to observe subtle signs of danger, and to act with precision and empathy. Each sentence conveyed not only competence, but humanity. Each gesture reinforced his intention to protect, support, and sustain. As he spoke, Dylan noticed something shifting in the room's atmosphere. The doubtful glances softened, the technical words seemed less cutting. He didn't need to humiliate or confront. He simply needed to demonstrate through his presence and clarity that he was trustworthy. Years of experience on the battlefield had shaped more than just his ability to react physically. It had shaped his capacity to face emotional adversity, to withstand judgment, and to maintain integrity in the face of overwhelming pressure. The turning point came when Dylan turned to Brianna and spoke about the baby, not with theories or justifications, but with simple sincerity, about the need for care, constant presence, and unconditional love. He described his willingness to learn, adapt, and support what mattered most, the child's life and well-being. Each word touched not only Brianna, but everyone present, showing that courage is not just facing physical dangers, but assuming emotional responsibility with awareness and dedication. After a lengthy presentation, those in charge at the meeting began to perceive something they couldn't measure in reports. Dylan, silent and constant strength. The determination he displayed didn't stem from a need for recognition or power, but from deep conviction and empathy. He had indeed endured the horrors of war, but now he was demonstrating that the true battle is daily, invisible, and demands humanity as much as courage. When the final decision was announced, Dylan felt a restrained but profound relief. Permission for him to remain present and support Brianna during her pregnancy had been granted. It wasn't just a legal victory, but a moral, emotional, and personal one. Every challenge faced, every trial overcome, every sleepless night had contributed to this moment of triumph. Dylan realized that the war, which had once defined him, had now given him the tools to win invisible, silent, and equally important battles. Back in the apartment, the feeling of triumph wasn't euphoric, but quiet and intimate. Dylan helped Brianna sit up, making sure the space was comfortable and safe. He felt the baby move, and for the first time in a long time, realized that courage had transformed into something tangible. Protection, love, and constant presence. Every painful memory of the war, every trauma, every invisible scar had been channeled into strength to care for someone who depended completely on him. At that moment, Dylan understood the depth of overcoming. It wasn't about being a hero, nor about external recognition. It was about presence, constancy, and humanity. Life didn't only reward grandiose acts, it rewarded silent courage, the kind that remains steadfast in the face of judgment, fear, and uncertainty. He felt more complete, more alive, and above all, aware that true courage is made of love, patience, and integrity. The climax of the story didn't end with applause or noisy celebrations, but with a powerful calm. Dylan, a war veteran, had faced his greatest fear: the possibility of failing not in combat, but in humanity. He knew now that he could support Brianna, the baby, and in a way his own life, in a way he had never imagined. The victory was silent, but eternal. If you'd like, I can continue now with topic 10, the conclusion plus final moral, closing the story with emotion, reflection, and a poetic, cinematic phrase. Would you like me to continue? The small town awoke to a soft, timid light that morning, as if the whole world recognized the silent importance of what had happened. Dylan Carter felt different, not because of physical or external changes, but because of something deep, internal. The war veteran, who carried on his shoulders years of invisible scars and memories of battles lost and won, finally experienced a sense of complete purpose. The tension that had marked weeks of his life had transformed into a silent peace. A feeling of mission accomplished that didn't need applause to be felt. Brianna, sitting on the sofa in the now organized and safe apartment, smiled with a rare serenity. She stroked her belly, feeling the baby move more frequently, as if sensing Dylan's constant presence. Every small gesture from the veteran, his ever-present hand, his attentive gaze, his careful and precise actions, had become the foundation of confidence that sustained the young mother. Dylan, in turn, felt his heart light, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time, because the war and past traumas had taught him that emotions were dangerous and vulnerable. But at that moment, he understood that true strength lies precisely in the capacity to feel and act with humanity. The city gradually began to recognize the veteran's quiet dedication. Those who initially looked at him with suspicion now realized that Dylan not only took responsibility, but that his presence transformed lives. There was no need for formal reports or testimonies. His consistency spoke for itself. Every small gesture, every night spent awake, caring for Brianna, every moment he intervened to resolve unexpected situations, built a narrative of trust that was impossible to ignore. Even the most veiled criticisms began to diminish. Bruce Hale, who had initially questioned his ability, began to realize that his hasty judgment had failed to consider the true measure of courage. He observed Dylan act with patience, empathy, and quiet strength, and couldn't help but recognize that the veteran had overcome far greater obstacles than most people could imagine. Public perception slowly but irreversibly transformed. Dylan's presence was no longer seen as a risk, but as a pillar of safety and hope. For Dylan, the greatest lesson came from within himself. He understood that life's battles often don't involve physical confrontations or instant decisions, but prolonged moments of care, vigilance, and presence. The discipline acquired in war had become a powerful tool, but now applied to sustain life, hope, and love. He discovered that the deepest courage is not the one that receives recognition, but the one that manifests itself silently, constantly, and selflessly. As the days went by, Dylan and Brianna developed a harmonious routine. The veteran learned about the importance of small daily actions, preparing meals, organizing rest schedules, ensuring that every detail of the environment was safe and welcoming. Each movement carried the intention to protect, but also to transmit tranquility. Brianna, in turn, felt strengthened not only by physical security, but by unwavering emotional support. They formed a silent partnership, a protective network that did not depend on external recognition, but on the mutual commitment to care for each other and the baby who was about to arrive. The birth finally happened on a clear and serene morning. Dylan stayed by Brianna's side, holding her hand, guiding her with firmness and tenderness. When the baby was finally born, crying vigorously, Dylan felt something that transcended any emotion he had ever known. The war, the losses, the traumas, everything seemed to converge in that instant of pure humanity. He held the little one in his arms, feeling a mixture of responsibility, relief, and unconditional love. Every painful memory from the past seemed somehow to find meaning in that moment. The life he was helping to protect was an extension of everything he had learned about courage, sacrifice, and resilience. The city witnessed the silent conclusion of that story. Dylan, the lone war veteran, had faced not only external judgment, but also his own fears and unseen scars. He had transformed pain and trauma into quiet strength, using combat experience, discipline, and humanity to protect and support. His presence, once questioned, became a symbol of true courage, the kind that manifests itself in constant care, patience, and determination to face seemingly invisible, yet profoundly significant challenges. In the end, Dylan understood that life doesn't only reward large-scale heroic acts, but also the daily, silent courage demonstrated in love, responsibility, and constant presence. He felt complete, not because of external achievements, but because of the transformation that had occurred within himself. The war had taught him to survive. Life was now teaching him to be truly human. And so, as he watched Brianna and the baby sleep peacefully, Dylan reflected on everything he had faced. Losses, traumatic memories, judgments, and fear. He realized that each challenge, each obstacle, each anxious night had prepared him for this moment of fulfillment. And in silence, he concluded that true victory is not about defeating visible enemies, but about sustaining life and hope, even when the world doubts your ability to do so. In the end, Dylan Carter's story concluded with a lesson in humanity and courage. True strength lies not in what you defeat, but in what you protect, even when the world doesn't believe you are capable. And so we conclude this story, but before you move on, I want to invite you to be a part of this journey here on the channel. If you've made it to the end, leave a comment like "I'm with you until the end," or "This message was for me," so I know you were here with me. If you felt a connection to the story and what we shared while watching the video, go ahead and leave a like. It's a silent way of showing that this message resonated with you. And if you want to continue reading, there's a video on the side that complements this topic perfectly. Click on it and follow along with me. And while you're at it, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel smartly so you don't miss any stories like this. Let's continue on this path together, learning, reflecting, and sharing moments that truly matter, always in a light-hearted and genuine way.